Welcome to the Backroads Build podcast. I'm Ben, and on today's episode, we are talking about the township of Matachewan, a town that has, according to Wikipedia, 268 people that live there. And today we did get a chance to chat with Ken Mccollam, who is not just a local, but he has a very major family tie to the area, connection to the town first being created and thriving as a mining town, very similar to Abitibi Canyon, but on a much smaller scale. And both him and Bill believe Matachewan is the place to be. And very soon, it will be the place to be for not just tourists, but also people looking to relocate.
North Bay Echo is proud to partner with Twigs Coffee Roasters, a part of the community since 1995. Twigs offers a wide selection of quality beans, fresh roasted in-house every day. Find your favorite specialty drinks at our espresso bar, rejuvenate with freshly squeezed juice, or treat yourself to mouth-watering selections from our gourmet deli. And don't forget our irresistible fresh baked goods, including uncompromising gluten-free options. Twigs has 5 locations to serve you, from North Bay to Sargent Falls to Sudbury. Order online for pickup at Twigs.ca. And coming soon, you'll be able to order fresh roasted coffee beans direct to your doorstep from our distribution center in North Bay.
Well, today on the show, we are talking about Matachewan, which has a population of, according to Wikipedia, 268 people. It's not a large town, and we brought in on the show one of those 268 people. We'll call him the expert of Matachewan, Ken Mccollam. Ken, welcome.
Thank you, sir. I wouldn't say I'm an expert on much, but I'm glad to be here.
Bill, why don't you set the stage, because you were really excited to talk about this place.
Yeah, I had been up to Matachewan to do a story on Jacob's Cave, and we'll get to that. And when I met Ken and Lindsay at the Triple Z and Eats restaurant, I found out that I've called them the curators of memorabilia in the town. But anyway, I found out there's going to be a whole bunch of stories, and I did come back to do that story, and I'll be back again because in the story, the most recent story in Village Media, I said, why shouldn't you go to Matachewan? It's like many places in Northern Ontario that until you meet people like Ken and Lindsay and others, you don't know much about it. I mean, that's what Backroads Bill does, and he meets people. He doesn't know much about anything. So Matachewan, just for context, it's west of Kirkland Lake, west of Highway 11, and northeast of Elk Lake. And Matachewan's been around for a long, long time. It's a boom and bust community. Small population, has an active Alamos gold mine right now that's booming. The interesting thing, like many mining communities, the people that work there come in and out for the most part. And so that's the setting kind of where we are in Northern Ontario, but it has so many fascinating things with regards to its heritage, coming right up to contemporary times that I couldn't get enough of it. I mean, I only spent one day. I could have spent a week, and as I said earlier, I will be back. So it's kind of like one of those stories for me that is representative of what we have in our backyards and we don't even know.
Well, it reminds me a little bit of the Abitibi Canyon story we had. We had Bob Hunter on. It's a little bit of a bigger town, but the same idea, very mining heavy. Ken, are you involved at all in the mining world, or what exactly do you do up in Matachewan?
Well, we run a bunkhouse up here, so I guess I'm, on the periphery of the mining business, and I deal with a lot of miners every day. But no, we run a bunkhouse up here. Lindsay moved up here to do that about 5 years ago. We got together. I used to work for the township in some capacity, and so now I'm with her. We run a bunkhouse, and we're just about to open a restaurant. So no, directly related to the mine, no, but we deal with it every day, and we're sure glad it's here. It's allowing us to do what we're doing now.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I must say that the restaurant is kind of like a museum. because it's all this memorabilia, and we're going to talk about a lot of that because that's the first thing that caught my eye in the former restaurant. The new restaurant is just in transition into opening, so that's what really caught my attention. So and maybe we'll go back, and I'm just thinking about, should we approach this on what happened in the day I was up there, or maybe I should go back to Jacob's Cave, because Jacob's Cave, I came onto the Matachewan website, and here's this a reference to Jacob's Cave. So I thought, who is Jacob? And what's this cave all about? A prospector lived in a cave, and there was another one over by Larder Lake. And on that particular day, found the two caves. And in this case, it was the man's name was Jake Davidson, who lived in this cave, and along with Ken's grandfather were the kind of the original prospectors, some of the original prospectors in the area. And it all came to fame and fortune eventually. But Jake lived in a cave, kind of, had a door on it, and the door is going to eventually make its way to the restaurant. Anyway, he lived in this, and of course, like many prospectors, lived on the land and did all his thing. But anyway, that was the first instance. And then of course, I clued into the fact about Fort Matachewan, which was a Hudson Bay Company post, and so that intrigued me as well. So there's a bunch of things that led into coming back to Matachewan.
And Ken, why don't you tell us a little bit about your grandfather? I didn't know he was into prospecting. How was that something that you kind of grew up with at all, or you were part of?
Oh yeah. No, we're all rock lickers up here. We we decorate the outside of our houses with big pieces of fancy stone, and that's how it is. Well, he was from Placer Valley, California, Scottish heritage, Mormon, and so he and his family are still well established down there. He came up here, as a lot of these prospectors did. They traveled around to various places from Deadwood up to Alaska and then back down through Canada. I believe he got placed here coming out of the World War I draft. He came to this area immediately after that with Jake Davidson. They'd prospected earlier together. And so, yeah, that's how they wound up in this area. And my grandfather died in the 30s, so he never saw a lot of the prosperity. So Jake Davidson was my father's godfather, and so that's why I wound up with all this memorabilia, because it stayed with my grandmother and my father in this little tiny house that he had built and that I'm now in and blessed to be in. But this is where everything came from. So that's my grandfather. Not a long story up here. But these people, including Jake Davidson, I mean, they traveled long distances and saw a lot of things. So this cave, he stayed in it for a couple of years, I'm guessing, at the most. They lived in Toronto during the winters and would come up here and, of course, to spend the summer up there. But they kept their provisions there. Lots of reference to that in my grandfather's diary and stuff, to that cave. They kept everything in there because it was safe and it was dry.
Jake Davidson came from the Klondike Gold Rush, and there's a kind of Prospectors Hall of Fame up in the Klondike area, and he's part of that. So I want to go to Fort Matachewan, which goes back to the Hudson Bay Company, and it's about 10 kilometers, somewhere about 6 or 7 miles north of Matachewan. Yeah, and so it was there at a narrowing, and it was a Hudson Bay, and of course there's Matachewan First Nation. And on the day I went up there, we went over to Matachewan First Nation because we were going to launch our boat in a backway, so to speak. And the chief had sent some Sonny Batiste had sent some swag over, and we met a couple of characters. And off we went on that day. We'll probably talk about it. So we went all over the lake, and we've got to also remember it's near the height of land of the two the Arctic watershed, and of course the Great Lakes St. Lawrence watershed. So the whole Montreal River system is really, really important. But we eventually got to Fort Matachewan, and one of the highlights of this day was I had heard about this, that there was an American Civil War veteran buried at Fort Matachewan. So what's that all about? And so we had to go and find his headstone, and Ken knew where this was, and sure enough, Stephen Lefrakane was a soldier and came up and became the factor of Fort Matachewan after the American Civil War, and when he died, there was people had the wherewithal to petition the American government, because I did some research, and the standard kind of War Graves Commission kind of headstone is there. And when we went there that day, nature takes back everything, Ben, so quickly. And Ken, from memory, cut a swath up to where the small cemetery was. And there are many other people buried there, but long gone and forgotten with regards to headstones and things. But there was Stephen's headstone. And then, of course, we found the belfry and the steeple and the church bell. I've got so many things to say that the church bell ended back up in the contemporary cemetery in Matachewan. But that was just great to see by context that Fort Matachewan and that period of history. And another interesting thing, through Ken and others, they have made a kind of a landing on the river, and they had recovered a piece of guardrail from a construction project and put it on so the ice deflects on it. Anyway, I was just mesmerized by getting to this place. And now, since then, the town's going to go back and clean it up a bit, because this is a really important, I think, aspect of not only their history, but Northern Ontario history in Fort Matachewan. And there's a lot more to be said about all these things. But just to know about Stephen and his existence, transitioning from, he was born in Labrador, but went into the American Civil War, fought, then came up here and became the factor. He lived to, I think, 99 years of age. And so it's sometimes when you go to these overgrown cemeteries, and there's a book written on him as well, that you actually see all about this person and their life in a community.
He was one of our heroes, and that's the bottom line. He's always been in my life, so for people to not know who he is almost doesn't make sense to me, if you know what I mean by that.
So Fort Matachewan is one thing, and up the lake we went to some pictographs that I'd never seen before, and that was interesting. We went out to an old mining claim, the Thoris Gold Mine, and poked around there. And of course, the whole area has a lot to do with the first era of gold mining and that whole. And I mean, sometimes it amazes me how people eked out an existence and lived in the bush and in and around the area. So there were so many things to see on that particular day. Maybe Ken, just talk about the Thesaurus gold mine for a bit.
Well, Thesaurus was one of the first gold mines. I've talked to a few people about it since our trip, because everyone's coming up to us now. Who the hell were these people you brought up the river? And why is everyone so excited? Why is everyone all now talking about this stuff? And so a good picture of Richard Millen in the Thesaurus gold mine under those old timbers looking out at us. A lot of people are starting to ask questions. So I've since actually found the buildings we went looking for. They're still there. Up at the old Thesaurus mine. It's right at the head of the lakes, which is where the Montreal River begins. It started in the teens. It was before Matachewan became a thing, so the fort was their main, source of contact. And of course, the First Nation, which is just a few miles through the bush to the fort. I'm assuming that's why it was put there. But the Thesaurus was an early one that got interest going, I think, aside from the Bert Ashley find closer to town here. But not much is left standing. There's 3 buildings that are they're flattened and you can find them, but there's nothing left standing up there, as everything was. When I was a kid, you could play through the buildings. That's how quickly it's taken over up there.
We also went to visit the grave of Tom Fox, and maybe Ken, tell us about Tom Fox and his relationship with your grandfather and Jake Davidson, and how he could kind of smell the gold.
Well, I came at Tom Fox my whole life. I knew from Tom Fox Rapid, Tom Fox Lake, Tom Fox everything. I know his relatives up here, but I never really put 2 and 2 together. I grew up my whole life looking at a newspaper clipping. It was in my bedroom, and in the corner was Tom Fox smoking a pipe. And my grandfather was in that newspaper, so Tom Fox didn't matter at all, if you know what I mean. My grandfather was, of course, the center of it all. When my mother passed, I found entire newspaper articles written week to week, about 6 weeks worth of articles on Matachewan, the last gold rush. The entire point of this was that they were going to meet the great Tom Fox, who could smell the gold. He had some great finds. The rumor has it he found the Big Dome mine in Timmins. And so, of course, my grandfather and Jake Davidson were good friends. And the last entry in my grandfather's diary was saw Tom Fox on the way to the Whitefish Lake. That was the last entry in his diary that I have. So they were all very, very, very close. And so this article was all about going to meet Tom Fox up in the bush, and they met in, and it's all written like a Wild West show and Wild West novel, I should say. But so then as we open the restaurant and there's all these clippings, people come in from 10 years old up and go, well, that's my great-grandfather, and I know where that is. And it's blossomed into this great thing where Tom Fox is the center of everything up here. And it's fascinating because I've always known where his grave was. I've always kind of known the story. This is a good time to interject, too, that Tom Fox is probably not the most famous fox. I grew up with Granny Fox. In our memory. She lived across from my father, and they shared a hole in the river to get their water. She lived to 105. And she, in my mind, is the one that, when you talk about the Fox family, she's the matriarch of it all, and she's the most famous one of them all because she lived that much longer, where Tom Fox died in the 1930s. She died in the 70s, so that tells you the influence she's had. But you were there, Bill. I've had 4 generations of that family sitting in a booth in my restaurant, you know. It's amazing. And these are people that were my friends of my father's, you know, my father's friends I now call by their first name, and I'm sitting with their grandchildren having conversations. So it's interesting that this could have disappeared into the bush, but now, because of a few newspaper articles, and don't sell yourself short on stirring this up, it's come to life again. It's come to life.
There were 3 of the 4 generations that day, and they had cleared the ATV trail out of some windfall and get to where Tom Fox had his original cabin, which you can still see the outline. And then we walked to the gravesite. But tell us about that relationship with your grandfather and, of course, Jake, and that birch bark parchment that's part of the because Tom Fox died and he was buried there. But talk about that a bit. That's pretty neat.
Well, it sure is. And again, my grandfather died just before Tom Fox died. But they were all very close to the point where when Mr. Fox died, Jake Davidson built his headstone out of concrete, as you saw, shotgun shells, all kinds of the elements, the stones that would be found, the minerals, I should say more correctly, and they were embedded in this concrete of this headstone. And he put a piece of glass in there, he inserted this. This is in the 1930s in Matachewan, so I don't imagine this was done anywhere indoors. And there was a piece of birch bark with an inscription, and I'm sorry I don't have the book with me, but it says Tom Fox, hunter, trapper, father, things of that nature written on there. And it's always been there. He brought it in a toboggan. I don't know whether that means in the winter necessarily, but he erected it. And as I'm finding out now from everyone I'm talking to, it was just kind of maintained by everyone. As they came across it, they'd pull the sticks off it. And at various times there was offerings there. I heard yesterday there was 2 rifles that were left propped against that grave, and they were there for 30 years before they disappeared. I just heard that, whether that's, an actual fact. But you met the family, and they're awful proud. But yeah, that's the relationship with I believe Tom Fox and people like him allowed my grandfather and Jake Davidson to pursue their destinies, their dreams, if you will, in their explorations. And they had to, without those people, there's just no way it could have happened. And so that's why he has such a big standing in my mind as a family. They were spoken about like they were heroes.
Yeah, and so what I came away after the fact, and I think it dawned on me later, is that camaraderie and that relationship they all had, and they were, I don't want to say beholding to each other, but that kinship and everything they had amongst other, that is probably the highest testimonial that you can ever give to someone, to do something like that out of respect. And so just seeing that gravesite and knowing the stories meant a lot to me, and it's that those relationships that we have in life that are the most important things that we take away.
Surprisingly, it meant so much to me. I didn't know it did. And to be up there, Carrie Ann and I are the same age, to be up there with those people, seeing this stuff take place. I'm nothing but a bystander in all this. I'm the guy that, hi, pleased to meet you, welcome to the party. Now all the interesting people are in the party. But a story of my life. I've got great stories, never accomplished a thing, and that's what's happening here. But it's brought a real life back to to the whole. I don't want to say the whole area and speak in generalities, but there's a lot going on that was at least triggered by this. And it's great to see.
Well, that's another reason to have you on the podcast, and we'll have you back again. Now, there's so much more to be said. We talked a bit about the Jacob's Cave, and then we went over to maybe describe, Ken, the first, because your grandfather and Jake, as you said, and Tom, they didn't see the benefits of the gold discovery and in their lifetimes. But tell us about the first Young-Davidson gold mine and how that went.
Okay, the Ashley gold mine was the first. So it was about 20 miles the other side of where the Young-Davidson is now. Weldy Young was the financier, I understand, of the mine, and that's why it's Young and Davidson. Jake Davidson was the discoverer, and Weldy Young was the man who backed him up and the whole thing. It started, I'm going to say, I found some construction photos of the first Young-Davidson being built, and it says 31. Now, that's some of the first bigger stuff. So I know there'd been some operation there since 28 to keep his claims open. But it started basically 31, 32. By 34, I've got pictures of entire crews mining. So by 34, it was up and running. It joined with another mine called the Ventures Mine and became Matachewan Consolidated Mines. So I'm going to say the late 30s, I'm assuming in and around there. And by the late 50s, everything had closed down. The price of gold had dropped to the point where I guess it just wasn't worth it anymore. So like a lot of these towns, everything closed up. And that's when Matachewan began to shrink in the late 50s. But yeah, the problem with Matachewan is we have high-grade ore. We've got gold everywhere you look. You trip over it, it shines at you, the crows pick it up and fly away with it. But it's so low-grade that the price of it has to be worth getting it out. There's so much of it. We're not chasing a narrow vein. My understanding is they're finding a lot of high-grade stuff now, really not far from the old Young-Davidson site, like right on the site, but they just missed it by a bit. So that may have helped us out if in the day they found that. But yeah, that's the original mine closed in the late 50s.
And so there was that boom and bust to the community, and it's a small community, as you said, Ben, probably around 300 people thereabout. And there's the one restaurant and bunkhouse, and there's we'll call it the corner store, general store, and a few other businesses, and that's about it in the community. But there's so much more in its natural and cultural heritage that that's why there's good reasons to go to places like Matachewan. But it's not. It is written down. There's a couple of books, but there's so much more to discover in that regard. So it's one of those places that we think we have these 5 cities in Northern Ontario, but we think we don't really know about what's in our own backyard as far as the smaller communities.
Yeah, and I'm kind of curious, Ken, outside of the mining stuff, I'm sure that your population increases, right, when you have miners coming in and out quite a bit? Yeah. So outside of the people who are in the mining, like what other sectors are there for people who do, like what other kind of work do people do there?
Well, starting in the 60s, mining was essentially gone. We had a small barite mine here that employed about a dozen men. So barite, for barium and all those things, brake pads and everything else. So that sustained. Logging, of course. Logging was big. We're not really old growth with a lot of the fires that came through here, but a lot of logging. My dad was a trapper. A lot of people still live, very traditionally up here, or at least, did. What's happened now is, my father was a trapper. He also worked for the MTO, so he plowed the snow and he graded the roads and things like that. So we were fortunate enough to be able to stay where a lot of people had to leave. Tourism was more of a factor in the 70s and 80s than it has been recently, but that's picking up and changing. We hear things like the new Muskoka. People aren't afraid to come north now. So that's what's happening again. Whether there's 1,000 people working at that mine, we don't have a place for them to live. But I'll tell you, every roof has been done, every septic has been done. 3 years from now, there's going to be a lot more business. We see it happening. But it was logging, traditional type stuff. and tourism were the big ones. We had an asbestos mine come through here, early 70s, put a lot of infrastructure in for us and built, I believe, about 45 houses, brand new houses. Lasted 3 years, everything closed down, asbestos being asbestos, and those houses were sealed up and weren't sold until the early 90s with the green shag rug and the avocado fridges still in there. And so that's the boom and bust has been the thing, and a lot of promises. So when this mine came along, sure, promises. People like Lindsay in Muskoka heard about it, made the jump, and that's what's happening now. Is people like her were starting to revitalize the place, along with locals. Of course.
and we saw that a lot in North Bay. Like we've seen that during COVID, where people have moved up, especially with the idea of remote work. When you look at more of like things like Starlink that are available now that allow you to have much better.
I'm on it right now.
There you go. Yeah, when I was out in Redbridge, I was on Starlink as well, and it really, one of the biggest downsides living in the country was there was no internet. And in today's world, that's it's hard to do a lot of stuff without the power of the internet. But I guess one of those things is somebody who's lived there and has such a deep history in Matachewan. Do you have any worries that potentially you see a boom in terms of not just tourism, but people moving up there and potentially maybe destroying some of the heritage or changing maybe how Matachewan is? Like, is that anything that you kind of worry about?
Well, no, and two reasons. Our modern heritage was put here by a mine, so the mining industry is not going to change that. The new roads in that earth, and as far as the actual history of Matachewan, our indigenous people, of course, what's happening with that is they can take advantage of what's going on with the boom as well. And so in recapturing everything that's going on nationally, provincially, and locally with that, no, it's the exact opposite. We're about to cut trails in at the fort. We're getting people coming up to look at, when I say ours, I'm not an indigenous person, but these are the people I looked up to and grew up with and everything else. So that's why I say ours. So no, it's the exact opposite. I think things are really going to do well for indigenous people up here. Myself, we share a history going back to the late 20s as far as my family goes. So I don't claim any more than that. But even that local, more modern history with our accessibility to lakes and stuff, that was all done by a lot of the mining industry. The mining industry is a lot cleaner than it was now, right? They employ a lot better tactics and stuff. So no, I hate to see the mine up there. I hate to see these big piles of rock in the bush where I used to fish. I do. But that's how we got here to begin with as far as the town site goes. And so, no, in both cases, I think we're going to blossom in a way that is going to be, I think, call me an optimist, sustainable and done right. We're just far enough away. We don't have a lot of the big city problems, and I don't want to get political at all or in any way, shape, or form, but we don't have a lot of the problems that other cities have and are having right now that they haven't had in 20 years. We've still managed to avoid them. Part of that is we've priced people out. It's hard to find a place to live inexpensively here. So, but at the same time, we've gone from maybe 5 kids in town to about 60 in about 4 years. Think about that. So now there's everyone. We're looking in those directions for development and everything else. And our council's done a good job with a lot of infrastructure stuff. So we're doing well as a town and as a First Nation. They're blossoming like you wouldn't believe up there as well on the reserve. So no, to answer your question in a real long-winded fashion, no, I'm not worried about it. I don't think it's going to happen. I think anyone that comes up here, be they newcomer to the country or just to the area, is going to go, wow, what have we got here? And just take advantage of what's here and live the same way that we always have. I don't think we have a choice. The mosquitoes don't ask where you're from.
It's interesting how you talked about land, because it used to be you would go to some of these remote places and you would get cheap land and you'd be able to build relatively cheap compared to bigger cities, yeah. Right? It's interesting that you say they kind of price people out. Does that have to do with Crown land? Like, do you know the reason as to why land is so expensive up there?
Well, it just simply supply and demand. Lindsay's son bought a house 3 years ago for $40,000. That wasn't uncommon. And houses all around town, as they hit 45 and 50, people are going, what are these people thinking? Now they're all selling for $200,000,
wow.
$150,000. Yeah, and
that's
so
crazy.
the same houses.
We could do a whole program on this, because when I go into small communities across northern Ontario, whether or not the mill or the mine is closed down, you could go into them and, Bill, do you want this house? You can put it on your credit card. And what's happened too, two things have happened. One, hunters and fishers from afar have come up and bought these houses, and that becomes their hunt camp. They get a custodian in the community to look after their plant and property, and they keep their tin boats and ATVs there. So that's one thing. And then there's the movement that people come up and retire in these places as well. So there's these, and so communities are being sought after for lifestyle choices. And one of the things I wanted to bring us back to is the first thing you notice when you come into Matachewan, and there's this great big white mark on the side of a hill, a rock face, so to speak, before you cross the Montreal River. And there's a historic bridge there and plaque and the like. But tell us the story about that white mark, because I used that in the lead in my story, and it ended up that way because sometimes things stick out like a sore thumb. But what's that white mark doing up in the rock?
Well, it's another thing that's just always been there to me. I don't think too much about it, and everyone comments on it. Well, that's Peace Mountain. Now, it's a rock. I know it's a rock, so it's either Peace Rock or Peace Mountain, but it's our mountain. Now, since we've last spoke about that, I went and I saw one of the culprits responsible for putting that up there in 1967. So you've got to put yourself. So now is the Summer of Love. It's not like it was. Matachewan, there was no internet, there was no anything else. So it used to be what was popular in Toronto was in Sudbury the next year and in Matachewan 3 years later, and that's how it worked. So at the time now, here's all these kids. They've got radio, they can't be fooled, and now Time Magazine shows up with a great big peace sign on the front with the question, I believe it actually said, who are the hippies, where do they come from, and what can we do with them? That was on the front of this Time Magazine publication. This person apparently still has it. So anyway, 4 young people at the time went up there and put this huge peace sign on the rock. They climbed up that rock. There had been a forest fire come through here in the 30s, and so the rock was all bare. And I learned this week that it was put there because the old restaurant, the big window to the restaurant pointed straight across that to that rock. So that's what Peace Rock is. So now fast forward into, let's say the 70s when I was old enough to climb Peace Rock, and you go up there and everything else. We had some fundamental religious people come through over the years. Several groups I found out that wanted to paint over it. That's no, you can't have symbols, you can't have this, you can't have that for whatever reason. So it's been painted over. If you go up there now, it's 1.5 inches thick with paint. And I'm not even joking. I know I've done it a few times. Other people have done it a few times. The locals really treasure it. And it's not until someone threatens it that they realize they do. People that come from here, I know a fella named Kevin Jobson. I haven't seen him in years, but Jobson's a big family. I was on like Peace Mountain Leather. He's got a company named after Peace Mountain. He doesn't even live here anymore, like a lot of people who moved on. Peace Mountain Pizza is our pizza spin-off from the restaurant. So, but yeah, Bill, let's get that repainted. It's faded.
Yeah,
let's do it.
Yeah, no, I'm in. I told Ken I'm in, whether I can climb up there or not. I'm into.
We're going to cut a trail from the back. We're going to cut a trail from the back to get everyone who wants to get in there in there. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and so this is just one of the stories, Ben, of many stories, and many more stories to be heard when you go in and meet people like Ken and others in the community. We met JP and Richie from Matachewan First Nation, and that was just a treasure trove of information being exchanged. And in the story, I said, I talked about truth and reconciliation. I said that day to me was like Dances with Wolves, that 1990 Kevin Costner film. It's not about the film. It's just about how we were sharing information and learning from each other as we went along in this historic tour, so to speak. On the, it was one of the highlights of in many years of just that. It was chemistry.
It was a great day. I don't know how else to put it. And just everyone learned. And here's Richard Millen, a guy I've known my whole life, take for granted. He's about 5 years older. You know how those kids can be your heroes. He grew up the road from me, but I left here for 35 years. If you would have told me I've been in the bow of a boat checking for rocks as Richard Millen drove that boat up through the fort, going up the rapids, I would have said you're crazy. But I've always thought that's my river. When we hit that fort, between you and I, you weren't there. You were on the boardwalk. We said we're going to go ahead and scout some of this stuff out because there's some nasty vegetation in there. And so here's Richard. He let me wander, and I found this grave, and I was pretty proud of myself. And so I'm going to go find the church now. And he let me go about 30 feet one way, and he says, did you find the church last time you were here? I said, no, I looked for 2 hours. I couldn't find it. And he says, okay, well, let's get us back that way about 50 feet. He knew where everything was. Richard knew everything, and it was so good to be out with him. I forget about Richard sometimes, what a great guy he is. And John Paul worked with my dad for about 20 years or so. So to get to call him John Paul instead of Mr. John Paul was a big thing, too, to me. He's a great guy. It was just a great day. Everybody taught everybody, with the exception of myself, I think everybody taught everybody something. Whether it was about glaciers or about local history, it was just a great day. I thought it was a great day.
Yeah, it was one of those chemistry days where everything
it really was.
Everything fell into place, and the value of being outside and the natural and cultural heritage just came alive. And for me to write that after the fact, it was so easy from that emotional, affective domain to put yourself into that what you're really trying to tell the listener or the reader. So it's why go to Matachewan? There's so many more reasons, too many reasons, and more to discover.
Well, that kind of leads into what I wanted to wrap things up with. Obviously, you guys are on the separate end where, Kenny, you obviously have a huge, there's a lot of heritage and you have a lot of history that's embroidered into Matachewan with your family. Bill, you visited there. You don't have as much of a personal connection to it, but obviously it's still a special place to you. So I kind of wanted to bring it back to each of you, say, why you should visit Matachewan and what to you makes it so special.
Wow. Well, let's just hit me with that one quick. I left in 85 to go to Kirkland Lake. I left in 86 to go to Toronto. I fell in love. And I came back about 10 or 11 years ago. All through that time, I kept coming home. And for a lot of people who live home, well, they don't care where they're from. They're young men out traveling around. So, but during that time, everyone I met, I could drag up here and show the place off. I would. And I don't think I put enough value on that. So now I get back 10 years later, 10 years ago, and I really, really see the value in it because it's grown over. It's unchanged in a lot of ways. But the people up here are a lot like people from Newfoundland or groups of farmers. They're going to stop on the side of the road if you're broken down. And so I think to come up here, turn off your damn phone if you can. Spend a little time on some of this crown land, whether it's in a canoe or in an ATV or something. There's lodging coming, people. So there's going to be a lot of ways to come to Matachewan as well as reasons. But the amount of crown land up here and the amount of points of interest, and I know a lot of places can say that, I suppose, but you could come up here and camp up here for a week, never see the same thing twice. So to me, no matter what your interest, if it's fishing, canoeing, just plain camping, ATVing especially, well, you come up and tell me. Come up and tell me why. You're going to see. And come on into the restaurant, and we'll point you in the right direction. Or the Dog Star is the store coming in town. They'll point you in the right direction. That's the reason to come up here. It's a blossoming community that never lost its way. Let's put it that way. We never lost what we had. Some places did for a lot of reasons. I don't think we ever did. And a lot of that stuff is being brought to the forefront, reclaimed among a great big group of friends. And so come on, join the party. Let's do it.
Yeah, for me, it's an easy answer. Why not? And but it's for everything Ken just said and a lot more. For me, on the back roads and the backwaters, and you think about, okay, you hear about something and then you find the people that make it all come alive. And that's what happened to me in this particular case, as it often does. Again, I'm repeating myself, but I don't really know much. It's about the people I meet, and then they tell you everything there is to know that they know. And it also points to the value of oral history and how important that is. A lot of it is written down. There is at least a couple of books, but there's all these people that need to be recorded about all these stories. And so when I go onto the land and on the water and hear all these things, whether it's a gravesite or the church bell or the white peace symbol on the rock or an old, the remains of the old mill, it tells you about that there were people there and there was a lot there that went on in the past, and we should remember and salute that. And of course, that's what we do on the Backroads.
Well, a big thanks to Kenny for joining this show. Super fun guy to talk to. It always interests me that when you grow up in a small town or city, you kind of want to leave. We see that in North Bay. A lot of people who grow up here, they want to go. They want to go to Toronto. They want to go to Ottawa. They want to go to all these places they haven't been. And then what happens is you get to a point where you realize you prefer being where you started. And that kind of is how it goes with a lot of smaller towns. Now, North Bay isn't super small, but it's not super big either. It's kind of in that middle ground. And you see this all the time with people. And I find that a very interesting thing, a very interesting pattern that tends to happen. So if you want more Backroads Bill, of course, you can find us new episodes every single Wednesday morning. And you can find us on any of your favorite podcast platforms, whether it be Apple or Spotify. The video version, of course, is available on the North Bay Echo YouTube channel. And as always, you can find the latest episodes of not just us, but a whole bunch of other different local North Bay podcasts on NorthBayEcho.ca. And while you're there, you can check out shows like To North Bay with Love and the Echo Essentials podcast, and of course the newsletter of the same name, Echo Essentials, which is a great curated way to get local news, events, and all the happenings in the Echo Community Podcast Network. We will be back next week as Bill takes us on yet another Backroads adventure.